So we are now officially launching this event. Excellencies, dear colleagues, welcome to this new session of the Road to OEWG 3 series of events co-organized by the Geneva Environment Network and the ad hoc open-ended working group on a science policy panel on chemicals, waste and pollution prevention on the road to their third meeting that will take place in Geneva next month. We are here because the United Nations Environment Assembly in 2022 made history by adopting a series of landmark resolutions, including the one that decided to convene the ad hoc open-ended working group. In the context of the triple planetary crisis that the Earth is facing of climate change, nature and biodiversity loss, as well as pollution, two independent international intergovernmental bodies to help policymakers taking the right decisions have been set up for two of these crises. For climate change, we have the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, known as IPCC. For biodiversity loss, we have the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, known as IPBES. And the aim of the United Nations Environment Assembly resolution that is bringing us again together today is to set up a science policy panel for the third crisis on chemicals, waste, and pollution. So in the lead up to the establishment of this science policy panel, this series of events aims at building bridges and promote collaboration and knowledge sharing between and among stakeholders and to raise public awareness, preparing proposals for the establishment of the panel. Last month, we kicked off the series discussing capacity building. This was followed last week by a detailed presentation of the documents that have been prepared for the June meeting. Today, speakers will provide a historical overview of the origins of this process, key milestones to date, and a record of ongoing negotiations towards the establishment of the panel. The series will finally culminate on 6th of June, where we will have the traditional briefing ahead of the negotiation. I would also like to highlight again that Geneva, where the third session of the Open and Working Group will be taking place, is a global hub for for the governance of hazardous substances and the environment, of course, also. Geneva is indeed a home of various organizations and multilateral processes actively working to reduce the environmental and health risks from chemicals and waste and tackling pollution. And as coordinator of the Geneva Environment Network, I can confirm that there is still a great interest and enthusiasm from many Geneva-based stakeholders to welcome the delegates joining us from all over the world for a timely outcome of this negotiation. The working group is indeed expected to conclude its substantive discussions on proposals for the establishment of the panel at this meeting. And before handing over to Michel Chihen, head of the Global Affairs section of the Swiss Federal Office for the Environment, who will provide a few words of welcome as a member of the Bureau of the Open and Working Group and host country for this session, let me remind all our attendees that the documents, the video, and the summary will be made available as usual on our website, and the link is being shared in the chat and on the screen. And throughout the event, you can raise your questions by using the Q&A box. We have two dedicated sessions to answer these after presentations. Nalini Sharma from the secretariat of the Open and Working Group will moderate this session and take over after the welcoming remarks. With that, Mr. Chiren, you have the floor. And you are muted.
I try again. Thank you very much, Diana. I hope you can hear me now.
Very well.
Perfect. Thanks for this introduction. Thank you very much to UNEP and the Geneva Environment Network for organizing this event. And thanks for the opportunity to speak. You have said it in your introductory remarks, Diana. It has long been in place for climate with the IPCC and for biodiversity with IPBES. And it has proved to be useful to have for these areas intergovernmental science policy panels that work to provide a global scientific consensus on important issues. And for the area of chemicals and waste, such a panel has been lacking. Therefore, all UN regions, through their bureau members, have been very supportive, and the UN member states have been very engaged and supportive in various meetings and processes in the efforts to establish a science policy panel on chemicals waste and pollution prevention. And indeed, to understand where we are going, it is worth looking where we are coming from and pause and see what steps were already made, where we're at, and what examples there are also from the past to be considered. So this event is indeed very timely. Governments took a very clear decision with UNEA Resolution 5/8, establishing an independent intergovernmental panel that delivers policy-relevant scientific evidence without being policy prescriptive. And in fact, before this UNEA resolution, there was a UNEP report mandated by a former UNEA resolution, and that report presented several forms that this new science policy panel could take. And member states clearly went for the one specific format, which is an intergovernmental panel, which is transparent and impartial. So the intergovernmental aspect is indeed very important, because such a panel is not just about producing reports. We can have excellent scientific work done and published in many reports. However, if the governments do not see the relevance in the work done, or if the governments do not trust the work of the panel, then the impact of these reports and such a panel as such will remain very limited. So these elements are also being highlighted in the Bureau, because they keep coming as comments also from the member states. And with IPCC and IPBES, we indeed have good models to consider, and it would be a missed opportunity to start from scratch. We should definitely not reinvent the wheel. Many properties and wording from those panels and their policies and decisions can and should be used for the new SPP, and of course adapted where needed. And if you look at the draft or advanced documents for the next negotiation or the last negotiation session, you will see that some of the elements proposed in the documents do follow that logic, which is really useful. So another aspect is that it is very important to get out of the environment silo with the panel. The work should address cross-cutting issues, the nexus of environment and health, including the health of workers and many other groups, is particularly important. And the ESPP Bureau has also welcomed several times the WHO to its meetings because of this important linkage and nexus between health and environment, and in order to hear considerations on how we can integrate the expertise from health and environment. This expertise of UNEP and WHO are both crucial for the panel. The networks of both institutions are crucial to reach policymakers and scientists and other stakeholders that we need to reach with the products from the future panel. So let me add, before I close, one additional point on my own behalf in this regard. One institutional way to ensure those joint benefits of UNEP and WHO networks and expertise is to have UNEP and WHO as institutional parents of the new panel, and thus have them provide a UNEP WHO joint secretariat to the panel, the administrative support from both UNEP and WHO for the panel will be a good way of benefiting from the knowledge and the networks of both organizations. And again, here it's useful to look back in history and the existing experience that there is. And a good experience is the one of IPCC. It has shown that the joint secretariat brings advantages. A panel that aims to strengthen the link between science and policy must be able to rely on the technical, political, and organizational expertise of main institutions that are relevant. And for IPCC, that has been the World Meteorological Organization and UNEP, and it works. So again, something good to be pausing and looking back and considering. So in a nutshell, I would say, in order to close, that the UNEA resolution on establishing the panel gives us the frame, and panels like IPCC give us good examples. So let's complete the rest in June at the OEWG 3 in Geneva. And thank you very, very much again for the opportunity. And back to you, Diana.
So I'll take over from now. Thank you so much for those opening remarks, Michelle. I really appreciate it. And just for the sake for colleagues, WHO will be presenting on their information document at the next webinar, which is on the 6th of June. And so further information, as you mentioned, Michelle, will be provided at that time. So on behalf of the Secretariat of the Ad Hoc Open-Ended Working Group, to contribute further to the sound management of chemicals and waste and to prevent pollution, and the Geneva Environment Network, our co-organizers of this session, I would like to thank all of you for joining today's discussion. My name is Nalini Sharma, and I'm with the Secretariat of the Open-Ended Working Group. Next slide, please. So as mentioned by Michelle, thank you. The next slide, please. This webinar is a companion to a forthcoming information document presenting an overview of the process towards establishing a science policy panel to contribute further to the sound management of chemicals and waste and to prevent pollution. This document was requested by the Open-Ended Working Group Bureau at its 13th meeting, which was held at the end of January this year. The document presents a broad overview of the process towards the establishment of the panel, including the early origins of the idea, key milestones to date, including relevant UNEA resolutions and decisions taken by the governing body, key publications, including from the International Labour Organization, who is here with us today, and the global scientific community. Next slide, please. Looking forward to the third session of the Open-Ended Working Group. The Open-Ended Working Group at its third session will be held from the 17th to the 21st of June in Geneva, Switzerland, as mentioned by Michelle. The document also presents a brief record of the ongoing negotiations towards the establishment of the panel, including decisions that have already been taken by the Open-Ended Working Group and key next steps towards the intergovernmental meeting. Next slide, please. I should mention that all documents, and as mentioned by Michelle, are being put forward to the Open-Ended Working Group at its third session, and these have been put forward, discussed at previous sessions of the working group, and now available on our web page, and the link is provided here. Throughout the session, relevant links will be shared in real time through the chat, where we also welcome you to share any questions and thoughts at any time. Next slide, please. So I will now very briefly present this record of process towards the establishment of the panel as outlined in the document, before turning it over to stakeholders from the global health, human rights, labor, and civil society for their very important perspectives. We will also hear from David Kapundula from the Environment Management Agency of Zambia, who has been a part of the open-ended working group process from the very beginning. Now on to the overview. The information document takes us all the way back to the first Global Chemicals Outlook, which was published by UNEP in 2013. The report was designed to inform governments and industry on trends in chemicals production, use, and disposal, while offering policy advice. And it was targeted to decision makers in order to build capacity and to implement policy change to protect the environment and human health. It represents an important early milestone for the global chemicals management community. Next slide, please. At least 17 major studies were produced by international organizations and the global science community between 2013 and 2022, when the United Nations Environment Assembly decided that a science policy panel should be established to contribute further to the sound management of chemicals and waste and to prevent pollution, with the ambition of completing the work by the end of 2024 through Resolution 5/8. These publications collectively established a strong knowledge base around the potential benefits of a scientifically sound and evidence-based detailed assessment of the state of environment for awareness raising, informed policy formulation, and decision-making in the context of sustainable development. This is a quote from UNEA Resolution 1/4, which I will get into in the next slide. So individually and collectively, these publications represent a global consensus and call to raise global awareness of pollution and neglect of pollution-related disease and mobilize the resources and the political will needed to effectively confront pollution and to make pollution prevention a high priority nationally and internationally. These are quotes from the 2017 Lancet Commission on Pollution and Health, which was updated in 2022. The 2022 update reports that, as we know, pollution, climate change, and biodiversity loss are closely linked. Successful control of these conjoined threats require a globally supported formal science policy interface to inform intervention, influence research, and guide funding. I would like to give the spotlight now to the 2017 UNEP report, Strengthening the Science Policy Interface, a Gap Analysis, which was requested through UNEP Governing Council Decision 27/2 and UNEA Resolution 1/4. The analysis was aimed at identifying how to improve the science policy interface and provide practical steps that the member states and international organizations can take to fill these gaps. For the fourth session of the Environment Assembly, UNEA 4, UNEP tabled a two-part information document entitled Strengthening the Science Policy Interface in International Chemicals Governance, which reflects views from a multi-stakeholder workshop on strengthening the science policy interface in international chemicals governance held in Geneva in 2018, and the results of a mapping and gap analysis conducted by the International Panel on Chemical Pollution, the IPCP, who are here with us today, which reflects views on international experts. It reflects the views of international experts on desirable objectives, functions of a strong two-way science policy interface, and additional possibilities for strengthening a chemical science policy interface. Next slide, please. Okay. The second UNEP Global Chemicals Outlook was released in 2019, including a summary for policymakers and a synthesis report that presents options for action, including to bring knowledge to decision makers and strengthen the science policy interface and the use of science in monitoring progress, priority setting, for example, for emerging issues, and policymaking throughout the life cycle of chemicals and waste. The summary for policymakers makes clear that a comprehensive global framework is needed with ambitious priorities and coherent indicators, and that global knowledge gaps can be filled, for example, by strengthening science policy interface through enhanced collaboration between scientists and decision makers. A series of reports were prepared for UNEA 5, including an assessment of the options for strengthening science policy interface at international level for the sound management of chemicals and waste in 2020. And in 2022, the global scientific community called for a global science policy body on chemicals and waste, including through an open letter published in the Science Journal and an IPCP campaign following the letter's release. The ILO, who we'll hear from shortly, published an important study on the health impacts of exposure to hazardous chemicals at work, which calls to enhance the science policy interface for occupational health and safety, and states that developing a robust two-way science policy interface as part of the global efforts for sound management of chemicals represents a priority for the world of work. Now, moving on to the key decisions and resolutions, we will start in 2013 at the first universal session of the UNEP Governing Council, where Council, through Decision 27/12, decided that UNEP will promote a strong science policy interface by reviewing the state of environment, building on existing international instruments, assessments, panels, and information networks, including through an enhanced summary for policymakers for the global environment outlook. In 2014, the Environment Assembly's first session requested through Resolution 1/4 that the Executive Director promote a strong science policy interface and to foster collaboration with multilateral environmental agreement secretariats, relevant United Nations agencies and programs, and scientific panels for joint efforts to strengthen the science policy interface. It also requested the 2017 gap analysis I just mentioned, as well as recommendations on policy instruments for a strengthened science policy interface to the United Nations Environment Assembly at its second session. At UNEA 4 in March 2019, the Environment Assembly, through its Resolution 4/8, pointed to the urgent need to strengthen the science policy interface at all levels to support and promote science-based local, national, regional, and global actions on sound management of chemicals and waste beyond 2020, the use of science in monitoring progress thereon, and priority setting and policy making throughout the life cycle of chemicals and waste, taking into account the gaps and scientific information in developing countries. It also requested in 2019 an assessment of options for strengthening the science policy interface at the international level that I mentioned earlier in the presentation. At UNEA 5.2, the second part of UNEA 5, the United Nations Environment Assembly adopted its medium-term strategy for 2022 to 2025, which includes a science policy subprogram with actions and interventions that include developing an inclusive science policy interface that speaks to all. Finally, and perhaps most importantly for all of us here today, through its Resolution 5/8, UNEA decided that a science policy panel should be established to contribute further to the sound management of chemicals and waste and to prevent pollution, with the ambition of completing its work by the end of 2024, and to convene an ad hoc open-ended working group to prepare the proposals for the science policy panel, which brings us to our current process at the moment. So that takes us to the open-ended working group process and the ongoing negotiations. The open-ended working group convened for the first part of the session. We call it Open-Ended Working Group 1.1 in Nairobi in a hybrid format on the 6th of October. And for its resumed first session of the Open-Ended Working Group 1.2 in person in Bangkok, Thailand, from the 30th of January to the 3rd of February 2023. At its first session, next slide, please. At its first session, the open-ended working group worked through procedural matters, including the establishment of a bureau and indicative budget. It adopted rules of procedure for the conduct of its work and elected a chair, Ms. Goody Alkemade from the Netherlands. At its second session, the open-ended working group agreed to establish contact groups to address the organization of work of the open-ended working group, the scope and the principal functions of the Science Policy Panel, and agreed on an intersessional work plan. And this is available in various documents. At its second session, the open-ended working group decided with respect to the objective and functions of the panel to undertake horizon scanning to identify issues of relevance to policymakers and, where possible, proposing evidence-based options to address them, conduct assessments on current issues, and identifying potential evidence-based options to address, where possible, those issues, in particular those relevant to developing countries, provide up-to-date and irrelevant information, identifying key gaps in scientific research, encouraging and supporting communication between scientists and policymakers, explaining and disseminating findings for different audiences and raising public awareness, facilitate information sharing with countries, in particular developing countries seeking relevant scientific information, and capacity building. For capacity building, the function text is still to be discussed and will be brought forward for discussion at the third session. Next slide, please. The open-ended working group convened for its the second session in Nairobi at the end of last year in December, and began discussions on key topics for the future science policy panel, including focusing on foundational elements. And as mentioned by Michelle, a lot of the documents that were prepared for these sessions were really built on existing work that has been done under the different panels, building on the lessons learned and taking the good practices and best practices forward. So at its second session, the open-ended working group worked through some procedural matters and began discussions on key topics for the future science policy panel, including focusing on some of the foundational elements, on operating principles, on capacity building, institutional arrangements, and the evaluation of the operational effectiveness and impact of the panel. The open-ended working group at the second session also began discussions on the conflict of interest policy and work-related processes and procedures. Next slide, please. The outcome of these discussions is a compilation of proposals that have been prepared by the open-ended working group secretariat and presented for consideration and discussion at the third session. These documents are currently available on the Open-Ended Working Group 3 webpage. They were introduced in detail last week's session at the Road to Open-Ended Working Group 3 webinar series. So if you're interested in advance of the third session, the entire series is available for you viewing online on the Geneva Environment Network site and the YouTube channel, and the link should be shared now through the chat. So here's a quick snapshot of the working documents for the third session. I won't go through it. As I mentioned, we already had a very detailed, in-depth look at these documents last week at the documentation webinar. And the next slide provides the list of the information documents for the third session. Again, these were all addressed in depth last week, so we welcome you to refer to the recording of the session. Looking forward to a successful open-ended working group 3, the main outcome of the third session of the ad hoc open-ended working group will be final text proposals, what we're calling the foundational document, which is essential for the establishment of the panel and is to be transmitted to the intergovernmental meeting to be convened by the UNEP Executive Director, together with the draft rules, procedures, and policies. At its third session, the open-ended working group may also wish to consider proposals for arrangements that the intergovernmental meeting and the governing body of the panel at its first session or subsequent sessions will be invited to decide on in order to give effect to arrangements emanating from the foundational document. So operationalizing those elements, which would include the election of officers to constitute the Bureau, the administrative and financial arrangements of the Secretariat. We heard a little bit from Michelle earlier about some of the thinking from member states on the financial arrangements of the panel, strategic partnerships that need to be looked at and established, and the process, of course, for determining the work program, including prioritization, a very key part of our work. Next slide, please. In case you missed it last week, a very quick summary on the important next steps. So all working documents are now available in the 6 UN languages on the website. Governments and stakeholders are invited to provide written inputs on the working documents by the 31st of May. And if we can please encourage governments to provide their submissions through the national focal points, and non-government stakeholders are invited to provide their submissions on behalf of their organization or group. With that, I would like to take this opportunity to wish the Open-Ended Working Group a successful third session in view of the intergovernmental meeting, the first session of the governing body. We have a lot of work ahead of us, and we really look for fruitful, engaging discussion in June in Geneva. And maybe I can open the floor for any questions before turning over to our esteemed speakers. I see no. We have a number of questions that are coming through the chat, so let us take them one at a time. So the first question, within the mandate of this panel, are there mechanisms to persuade, nudge countries to finalize approved funds to implement the BRS, SICAM, etc.? So that's a very good question. Of course, we are talking about a science policy panel. This will bring scientific information to the to decision makers to take important policy decisions. It really will depend, of course, on the types of questions, the policy relevant questions that are being posed in order for us to do the work that the panel will undertake. So we will come back to you on that question probably a little bit later once we've heard from the other speakers. Some of the other questions I can see as well are really, I think, maybe might be addressed by some of the speakers, and perhaps we can move now to the speakers. Let's hear from them, and then we can come back to some of the other questions that are being posed in the chat. Thank you very much. So with that, I would like to now turn our attention to the second part of this webinar to hear from perspectives from labor, human rights, and civil society. I'd like to first invite Halshka Grasik, who is the technical specialist from the International Labour Organization. Halshka, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Nalini. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you also very much to the Secretariat for the invitation, for having ILO here about this important discussion. The International Labour Organization represents a variety of views from the world of work, from the labor perspective. The ILO is a tripartite structure, which means that it brings together governments, usually ministries of labor, but also workers organizations and employers organizations to have a tripartite structure of governance. And this really brings a leverage to a discussion like this. So I'm really glad to present a few points about the labor sector perspective. Next slide, please. Okay, let's start by highlighting why it is critical that workers' voices are part of this panel, why we integrate the world of work, and why workers and workplaces should be at the heart of this kind of discussion. We know that every year from the research that we do here at the ILO, there is more than 1 million workers that lose their life every year due to chemical exposures. This equates to one worker dying around every 30 seconds. This is a global health crisis, and we know that we have to take action. We know that we have a number of fatal diseases, fatal injuries, things like cancers, neurodevelopmental disabilities, but we also have things like non-fatal injuries that lead to disabilities, that lead to a lot of economic impacts for the countries that we're talking about. And so this is a big problem all around the world that also needs more spotlight on it. And we're hoping that the Science Policy Panel can do that. We have to consider that, of course, there are public health implications from chemical exposures. We know that there are. However, workers are disproportionately affected. Workers are exposed to much higher concentrations for longer time periods. And because of the hundreds and thousands of chemicals that come to the market, risk assessment for workers struggles to keep up. So we know that we have a gap here. Next slide, please. Some of the ways that the ILO responds to such a crisis, the first one is by creating a legal framework for action using our mechanism of tripartite social dialogue. This is through the creation of international labor standards, conventions, which are legally binding international treaties. We have a number of them that cover chemicals specifically. We have a chemicals convention, a major industrial accidents convention. We have conventions on different sectors where chemicals are used, like agriculture, construction, mining, but also on very specific hazardous exposures, things like asbestos, things like benzene. So we have a plethora of these kind of legal frameworks for action. And the way that these frameworks are developed are through the most recent research, and then by bringing together our tripartite constituents to give a balanced and a validated view to creating these global standards. Now, in addition, it's important to recognize we also have codes of practice, technical guidelines. These are more practical guidance materials that provide more detail into various sectors. Our most recent one is the safety and health in textiles, clothing, leather, and footwear. Just right now, as I'm speaking downstairs, there's another code of practice being negotiated on safety and health, and of course, chemical use in the forestry sector. So we keep up to date by having these sectoral discussions and by bringing these tripartite constituents together to make such tools. Next slide, please. So in addition to that legal framework, we also have a very strong research framework. We have a number of publications and tools on chemical safety, which would be of very much relevance to the participants of this panel. These publications bring the most up-to-date research using our network of OSH institutes all around the world to bring us evidence on what we need to highlight. Now, this is also where the tripartite structure is very important. We have direct access to the workplaces by working with the workers and by the employers. We have insight into the most pressing challenges of hazardous chemical exposures throughout a variety of sectors and throughout the supply chain, from the start, from extraction, going all the way to waste and disposal. Now, in addition to these tools, we also carry out a number of technical trainings on all of these different issues all around the world through our 40 field offices. Next slide, please. And this is where it all boils down to. Why then is a science policy interface really essential for the world of work? Now, we know because of this pressing global health crisis, we need to have a strong evidence base for setting safety and health policies at two levels. First, at the national level, and then we need to make sure that that national level policy can be applied practically and enforced at the workplace level. So things that we need to really keep in mind for the world of work perspective and what can really be useful when it comes to outputs from a science policy panel is things like risk assessment for workplace exposures, understanding what are the biggest priorities. We've done some of that work in the research documents that Nalini presented on our global review that will be in the INF document. So some of these things need to be carried forward. So now if we know the priorities for workplace exposures, we need to go a step further and then conducting risk assessments and getting more information out of those risk assessments to make sure that we understand thoroughly the health impacts, both acute and chronic, especially if we're dealing with things like long latency periods. Now, this also affects the importance of setting implementation and the monitoring of occupational exposure limits, which are critical to protecting workers at the workplace. This needs to be done globally, also in developing economies where there are very hazardous exposures and not always the strong legal framework that is needed to protect workers. We need to be very considerate of the importance of scientific evidence for ensuring we know the differences for gender and also for workers in vulnerable situations that may be exposed, informal workers, migrant workers, workers with existing health conditions or disabilities. Now here I'm going to conclude, but I think it's very important that we talk about the fact that when the labor sector and the world of work is involved, we go beyond safety and health. We're not just talking about safety and health. We're talking about the world of work changing and evolving, and we need to think about just transition, the importance of green jobs, reskilling workers, developing up-to-date industrial policies when it comes to chemicals production and use, social protection, and many other. And that's what the ILO can do, is bring together these various policy issues from the world of work to be mainstreamed in such a science policy discussion. Now, I want to leave with a critical takeaway, and that's the importance of continued multi-sectoral engagement in this type of process. We see the need of having different sectors represented, labor sector, social partners, ensuring that workers and employers are informed, are integrated, are really brought to this discussion to ensure that this process is founded in social dialogue. Now, we also have other mechanisms of ensuring multi-sectoral engagement. We have programs like the IOMC that bring together many different participating organizations, different points of view, different themes, different areas of work that can only strengthen this process. So I hope to leave you with that and available for any discussion. Thank you so much, Nalini.
Thank you very much, Halshika. And I think, we have some really good takeaways, addresses some of the questions already being posted in the Q&A session. And with that, maybe I can now turn to Ana Paula de Souza. Ana Paula is the Human Rights Officer of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. So over to you, Ana.
Oh, thank you so much, and good afternoon or good morning or good evening for everyone following this session today. It's a pleasure to be here with you today, feeling relatively fresh from INC 4 and getting ready for the final session of the open-ended working group to establish this new science policy panel. Exciting times for environmental multilateralism indeed. Science is showing us how pollution and the unsounding management of chemicals and waste have become a threat to all human rights, including the rights to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, life, health, food, water, sanitation, a healthy work environment, equality and no discrimination, amongst others. And in doing so, science can give the tools for policymakers to take informed decisions. Science and human rights have the power to inspire hope and allow us to reimagine a world guided by evidence, a world that puts people, not greed and profits, at the center of decision making. But as we know, reality is not a bed of roses. Too many governments, policymakers, and big industry leaders are willfully shutting their eyes to science and deploying biased experts to sow doubt and undermining scientific facts, suffocating scientific evidence at the expense of people and the planet. The new Science Policy Panel has an incredibly important role in course correcting our current path, which we know it's a path of destruction. Scientists have provided powerful tools to hold polluters to account. And that's the very reason why the right to science needs to be protected. Safeguarding commercially sensitive information at the expense of human health and the planet must be a no-go. For science to flourish and develop, human rights principles of transparency, accountability, and participation are essential to make science objective and reliable, and to ensure that it's not subject to the interests that are not scientific and are inconsistent with human rights principles and the welfare of society. I've noticed that, not only me, but I think anyone that has read the resolution notes that talks about the safeguarding of the commercially sensitive information. And we must make clear that this cannot be used as an excuse or as a barrier to protect human health and the planetary health in first place. We need to keep our priorities in check. But a human rights approach, and that's why we have been really involved in all of the open-ended working group sessions, is because we really believe that human rights has a place not only in this science policy panel, but in all of them. But this is on the making, so we can always think that we can break ground when we are negotiating something new. And in our views, what does it require? It requires first that an effective science policy panel engages all rights holders and disciplines, securing opportunities for informed participation. Special attention must be paid to groups that have experienced systematic discrimination in the enjoyment of the right to participate and to enjoy the benefits of scientific progress and its applications. And we are talking here of like women, children and youth, persons with disabilities, indigenous peoples, frontline communities, amongst others. Knowledge empowers the community to exercise agency on their behalf, and this is powerful. Number two, we should also have in mind that information concerning the risks and benefits of science and technology should be accessible without discrimination. The new science policy panel must put in place all necessary efforts to overcome persistent inequalities in scientific advancement through culturally and gender appropriate means of education and communication, with the aim of encouraging the widest participation in scientific progress of those populations that have been traditionally excluded from such progress. 3, governments should fund research at the level that truly existential threat deserves. International cooperation on technology transfer, mobilization of resources, and sharing of scientific knowledge are essential to address deep disparities between countries and ensure that all people have a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. 4, as a precondition, there should be an enabling environment for the conduct of scientific inquiry free, with specific guidelines to ensure the protection of scientists engaging with the respective mandate of the panel. Heavy corporate influence, direct attacks on scientific studies, smear campaigns against scientists, misleading literature, and exploitation of scientific illiteracy. Those are some of the tactics used to sow doubt and suffocate evidence, keeping large parts of the population blind to the consequences of crossing the planetary boundaries, ignorant of how their choices are shaped by the profits of few, and completely unaware of what we are consuming. OEWG is calling for the new mandate to establish a system to prevent and address intimidation and reprisals against anyone engaging with the work of the panel. We hope states can agree to that when they reconvene in June. Number 5, and that's my last point, the SPP must include safeguards to avoid the risks associated with the existence of conflicts of interest by creating an environment in which actual or perceived conflicts of interest are adequately disclosed and regulated, especially those involving scientific researchers who give policy advice to policymakers and other public officials. Guidelines should also be in place to safeguard against attempts by business entities to achieve policy change by influencing research and knowledge production. In closing, it's our hope that states will meet the challenge that falls upon them by carefully drafting a new science policy panel with an ambitious mandate informed by robust, independent science. For this to happen, we must protect the right to science to ensure that everyone can enjoy its benefits. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ana Paula. That's very useful. I think when we heard from Michelle, we need to learn from other processes, best practices. And so we hope that some of these inputs that you've provided will help us and guide us in our discussions at the third session. And then with that, I will now turn to our third panel member, Miriam Diamond. Miriam is the Vice Chair of the International Panel on Chemical Pollution, IPCP. Over to you, Miriam.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'm very pleased to be speaking on behalf of the IPCP, which is the International Panel on Chemical Pollution. We're a small but mighty group of independent scientists dedicated to sharing information that enables the transfer of science into policy, very aware of vested interests that have distorted and changed, and I have attempted to change that information. We've had a history of being involved in developing the current science policy panel, and that was outlined by Nalini earlier. It started with work on outlining the need for the science policy panel and a gaps analysis in 2020. We published our paper in Science, Zhenyun Wang et al. In 2021 that further articulated the gaps. In 2023, we published a paper on the guiding principles for the panel. And then just this past fall, we published a paper that was very vocal in calling out the misuse and the abuse of vested interests, specifically conflict of interests of those that have a distinct material gain in outcomes of decisions. And with that, I very much appreciate the words of Anna Paula, who just spoke before me. So now I'm going to turn to comments on what the science policy panel, what we hope it will expect, what it will produce. I've got 6 points and then a takeaway. So I'm not going to start with the scope of the pollution problems because I think everybody knows that, but it's really important to understand that the scope and the magnitude of the problems continue to grow. We have unabated production of a wide and increasing diversity of chemicals, and we don't have the capacity to assess them. We don't have the capacity to understand emissions, where those emissions are occurring. So then how does the science policy panel address this incredibly complex diversity of different substances, complex pathways in the science behind it? So a science policy panel is specifically aimed to develop consensual knowledge, especially in matters that concern uncertainty. So that's really important and why you need independent experts that are distanced from vested interests, because we need the science to speak to uncertainty. A science policy panel should develop policy relevant recommendations that are able to guide governments to develop policies and practices with the goals that are consistent with the intergovernmental organization. The social influence of the science policy panel is gained by engaging independent science without the conflict of interest. That's where the trust arises between the output of the science policy panel and uptake. And we should emphasize that the science policy panel should produce solution-oriented analyses that can guide countries towards putting those solutions into practice. Now, what's very special about the science policy panel being an intergovernmental organization is it increases equity. Right now, mostly wealthy countries are able to immobilize science, to ask questions, to do the monitoring, and to direct which knowledge is generated. The SPP offers the opportunity for all countries to ask questions and to receive well-considered answers, for including questions that involve data gaps, significant data gaps that occur throughout the global community, and to enable those countries with limited capacity for data generation and scientific capabilities to receive well-guided, solutions-oriented advice and knowledge. So I'm up to my 4th point now. My 4th point is that the science policy panel is able to delve into complex interdisciplinary questions because it offers the opportunity to consider questions and issues that sit astride various organizations. And we note that Michelle Turin opened by saying that the science policy panel ought to be guided by both UNEP and WHO, recognizing that the questions that are being asked sit astride environmental and human health considerations. And in addition to that, the science policy panel offers the opportunity to inject different ways of knowing, including indigenous knowledge, traditional knowledge, the knowledge of local communities, that is really essential for both identifying issues and for identifying options for solutions. So, what types of assessments might this panel do? And we'll have a paper coming out, we hope, will be published on that before the meeting in Geneva. So we believe that the Science Policy Panel affords the opportunity to do retrospective and prospective analyses. Retrospective analyses are needed in order to address continuing, festering problems that just aren't going away, such as lead poisoning, highly hazardous pesticides, pharmaceuticals that are discharged into the environment that are causing the increase in antibiotic resistant genes that pose a tremendous problem. We also suggest that through horizon scanning, which is one of the functions proposed for the panel, that the panel be able to conduct prospective analyses. And we've offered an example of that. For example, chemicals and waste releases exacerbated by climate change. There's an enormous number of critical facilities located in coastal zones subject to slow sea level rise and flooding due to extreme weather events exacerbated by human-made anthropogenic climate change. We also have numerous historic landfills and contaminated sites located in coastal regions, and we also have other key facilities subject to threats of forest fires and other fires caused by, again, climate change. The SPP offers the possibility of exploring such complex issues through just mapping these facilities, especially in countries that don't have that capacity. It offers the possibility of bringing together other organizations such as IPCC for climate change, IPBES for understanding the implications for biodiversity loss, the World Health Organization, International Energy Agency, International Transport Forum, and so on. So the takeaway from our viewpoint of independent science are not stakeholders. We're here to provide guidance and expertise that increases the authority of the Science Policy Panel. We are not stakeholders. I want to say that we offer that the SPP offers the opportunity for multi-sectoral, interdisciplinary, complex problem solving to generate options, solutions that countries can take away to grapple with the continuing problems of chemicals and waste. And with that, I'll close. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Miriam, for your perspectives from very important. I would like to say stakeholder is how we are terming it, but we recognize what you have just said is the expertise that we are looking forward to engaging with in our discussions at the third session and beyond. And then with that, maybe we can just move to the part of our webinar that's looking forward to the third session. And I'd like to invite David Kapandula from the Zambia Environment Management Agency. David has been a strong supporter of the chemicals, the waste, pollution prevention agenda. And we would like to hear his perspectives today. Over to you, David.
Thank you very much, Nalini. Are you able to get me?
We can hear you very clearly. We cannot see you.
To see me now?
Yes. Go ahead.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So thank you very much, Nalini, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, dear colleagues. I know we are in different parts of the world. Let me begin by thanking UNEP and the Secretariat of the SPP for inviting me to make some remarks as we move towards the OEWG 3. As you've heard, my name is David Kapindula. I formerly worked for the Zambia Environmental Management Agency until last year when I retired. And I have followed and participated in this process from inception. But I'm currently also serving as Africa Region expert on chemicals and waste, assisting the African region negotiators on chemicals and waste issues. And regarding the SPP, it is a subject that's very close to my heart because during my many years of service and interaction with international issues under the chemicals and waste agenda, I came to learn that chemicals and waste still need a platform where there's interaction between science, policy, or better still, decisions are made by policymakers with regard to chemicals and waste issues, especially in developing countries, should be informed by science. Therefore, UNEA Decision 5/8 has given the global community a mandate to create a unique body dealing with science and policy issues, especially on chemicals and waste. Similar to that of IPPC, as we've already heard, and IPBES. This has one advantage in my view, and that chemicals and waste issues will receive the much needed attention at international levels, similar to climate change and biodiversity, as observed under the triple planetary crisis relating to climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution, where chemicals and waste are covered. I believe that this will in turn unlock the necessary resources for implementation of chemicals and waste issues at international level, as well as regional and national levels. Regarding the OEWG 3, I wish to encourage all delegates to come with a constructive and give and take spirit, because as we have already heard, it is the final session of our negotiations. Now, let me reflect on some of the key issues that are still outstanding and are critical to the process going forward at the OEWG 3. The first one is capacity building, as we've already heard. This issue is very critical to the existence and sustainability of the SSP, as the case is with other existing panels such as IPCC and IPBES. Capacity building has, as we heard already, has been agreed as one of the functions of the SPP at OEWG 1.2 and OEWG 2, but needs to be further defined. And currently there are two proposals in the text, but I would not like to dwell on the proposals, but emphasize a few aspects of capacity building. Firstly, they need to elaborate what capacity is to be provided and to whom this capacity is to be given. Others have also said there is need to mainstream capacity building in all the other functions of the SPP. This function is very critical to taking care of the capacity needs of developing countries in relation to the efficient functioning of the SPP. Secondly, the issue of work-related processes and procedures. Let me thank the secretariat for the proposals that they have made in the documents. However, I feel that there is need to have a schematic presentation of the or diagram by the secretariat to help to see the overall structure of the panel in relation, or to establish the relationship between the plenary, the bureau, the interdisciplinary expert committee, working groups, and other processes. Thirdly, the issue of data sources. Data sources, I believe, should be looked at carefully and should cover indigenous knowledge so that data will unlock problem definition and solution as well. Because definition of knowledge will lead to how the problem is framed and the solution is defined. It is therefore important that we do not discard indigenous knowledge and leave behind developing countries. Fourthly, the issue of crossover of mandates between other science policy bodies such as the POPROC, GFC, and others and with SPP should be looked at. As we've seen in UNEA, decision UNEA 5/8, it is clear on creating an authoritative knowledge body on chemicals and waste, such as the SPP. The other bodies already have their specific mandates, which should not be in conflict with that of the SPP. However, it is important to define how the SPP will collaborate and cooperate with other bodies. And the fifth aspect is the interdisciplinary expert committee. I believe it's sufficient and broad enough to cover all the issues, as it is a mix of expertise, including policy professionals. Therefore, in my view, there is no need for a policy committee, as this will cause more proliferation of structures. And then lastly, I feel that resourcing the secretariat is very critical. As one of the lessons learned from other mechanisms, a well-resourced secretariat in terms of staff and financial resources will enhance the work of the SPP. Therefore, there is need to ensure that the secretariat is well-resourced to cater for the needs of all stakeholders, including developing countries. I heard from Michelle from Switzerland that this proposal to have the secretariat hosted by UNEP and WHO, I think that would work. However, I think the issue of resourcing the secretariat is very critical. Finally, let me reiterate my appeal to all delegates attending the OEWG to come with a spirit of cooperation and give and take, so as to deliver on the mandate of UNEA Resolution 5/8. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David, for your thoughts in preparation for the third session. I think it's very useful for also the other participants to hear, especially coming from Africa Group perspective. Just maybe to clarify or to confirm that we will have information documents that will support some of the working documents. And so, for example, on the work-related processes and procedures, there will be further information, including some graphical representation of the information that's being provided in the working documents.
Thank you.
Thank you. So with that, I think that concludes at least this from the speaker side. We do encourage participants, if you have any questions or if you have any comments, if you'd like to put them into the Q&A section. We have some questions that have been posed already, and so I will ask the panel members and guide them to the questions if we can move to that part. So one of the first questions that was put was, what are the key objectives and priorities for the third session of the open-ended working group? And how do these align with the international commitments on the strategic approach to international chemicals management, now called the Global Framework on Chemicals, and the Sustainable Development Goals? So if I can ask Michelle Sharon, who is the Bureau member of the open-ended working group, to respond to that question, please. Michelle? You'll have to unmute yourself, Michelle. I apologize.
Thank you very much, Nalini, for passing this important question to me. So the Future Science Policy Panel will provide assessments of important questions. The questions or the topics will be gathered. So different, it means that different stakeholders, but certainly also among them international organizations and existing conventions and processes, they will be able to submit these topics and questions that need to be assessed by the panel. And the panel will then make a check that the questions that from a scientific point of view are being answered are policy relevant, and will provide answers and options with regards to these topics and questions. Always respecting that whatever the answer is or the option provided by the panel in various forms, because there could be assessment reports, but there could be also other products from the panel, respects the principle that these products are policy relevant, but not policy prescriptive. And then indeed it is an opportunity for other actors, including these institutional stakeholders, to pick up the analysis and the options in their work, included in their decision making and in their work in developing further steps. And so, for example, such a report from the panel could be considered by the global framework on chemicals in their work on a topic pertinent to them, or it could be considered by a chemicals and waste convention if it's the topic assessed is pertinent for the scope of the instrument. At the same time, certainly other actors like national policymakers should have access to these products and should be able to take them up. So just to say that, again, that in terms of topics and questions, these can be received from various sources, and then the products are being, made available so that they can be picked up by the actors that see merit with regards to the topics assessed. I hope that is helpful.
Thank you, Michel. As mentioned, these issues will be discussed at the third session. We have a number of working documents that will address some of the topics and how information or submissions can be sent in terms of the call for submissions. So if you look at document 2, add 3 and 4 in particular around the work-related processes and procedures and the development of work program, you'll see a little bit more detail in this regard. We have a question which I'll ask Halshka to respond to. We did hear a little bit about the tools and, of course, the policy strategies that are ongoing within ILO. But what are some of the successful examples of policies, strategies, and initiatives aimed at preventing pollution from chemicals and waste at the national, regional, and global levels? And what lessons can be learned from these experiences? So maybe if you can give some other examples from your work, that would be good to share with the participants. Thank you.
Thanks, Nalini. It's a big question. It's a good question. It could be a topic of an entire webinar because there are so many examples of national, regional, workplace level actions. I mean, what I can say is that what the ILO always does when it comes to implementing action is to follow a specific hierarchy of controls. So we can give examples following that hierarchy of control. The first would be eliminating, banning certain hazardous chemicals that we know are toxic, that we know cause deaths, that we know are carcinogenic, that have been labeled as such and classified as such. So the first step that we always go to is making sure that we can ban those chemicals or severely restrict their use and ensure that workers aren't exposed. Then we would go to the next step of substitution. So how can we continue to ensure that a process, that an enterprise, that a production mode and mechanism can continue to operate, but how can we substitute the most hazardous chemicals with less hazardous substitutes? For all of these types of actions, I think that one thing that brings together all of the actions is having a sound science base, making sure that we know what we're substituting processes with, knowing what we know ensuring that we know what the health outcomes are to know that we're not causing even further problems. We also have mechanisms that work directly at the workplace level. I mentioned the importance of occupational exposure limits, making sure that we have proper occupational exposure limits for the different types of chemicals that workers face exposure to, given their perhaps vulnerable status, given the number of hours they work, given the perhaps cocktail of chemical exposures that they're exposed to. So having things like occupational exposure limits. We have our processes of risk assessment, making sure that there's participative and constantly updated risk assessment at the workplace level to know that workers aren't being exposed. Now, all of these kind of actions are framed in that important avenue of social dialogue that I mentioned before, is making sure that employers and workers are on the same page, that there's a mechanism for collective bargaining, that there are other rights in place for workers to make sure that they have the rights to knowledge, the rights to remove themselves if there's a very hazardous situation, and that right to a safe and healthy working environment. So all of these actions must be shrouded in those, let's say, the three things that I mentioned. The evidence-based approach, using the most up-to-date scientific policies, making sure that we have social dialogue existing at the workplace level, and then making sure that we have that always evolving process of knowledge, making sure that we have up-to-date information and that the newest information can be transmitted both into the workplace and also coming out of the workplace to the scientists and the policymakers. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Tashka. The next question, if I may ask Miriam to respond to. And perhaps, Miriam, you can also come to the question that was posed to Halshka as well. But the question is, how can the Science Policy Panel support efforts to strengthen the scientific basis for decision making, enhance collaboration between scientists and policymakers, and promote evidence-based policies and practices? It's a very big question as well, but I know you spoke to a bit of it as well during your presentation, but perhaps you can just summarize a little bit in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you, Nalini. So first to the question of successes, because it's very important for us to be fortified by successes to give us the energy to move forward. So amongst the successes are those achieved by the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants. Those are the restrictions that Halshka just spoke about of some very hazardous chemicals, industrial chemicals and pesticides, and also through the Minamata Convention in order to control the use and release of mercury. And again, both of those examples involve workers' rights, environmental protection, and global issues that could not have been tackled by individual governments. So that's why we need global cooperation. Now, the second question is of how the Science Policy Panel can foster that type of interdisciplinarity, that the type of weaving together of different types of knowledge that it's needed to solve problems, including what David Kapindula spoke about is the importance of, say, Indigenous knowledge. And that's because the Science Policy Panel has the authority to bring together nominated experts, which, in our firm opinion, should not have vested conflicts of interest, but can bring together nominated experts from different countries to collectively address the problem and to be dedicated towards addressing the problem, bringing together needed disciplines and ways of knowing to collectively address the issue. Now, one thing that the Science Policy Panel can do is to foster the need in the scientific community to provide more tools for solutions-based assessments, to provide, as Michelle said, policy relevant, but not policy prescriptive assessments. So the Science Policy Panel is one way to give scientists the urge and to indicate the need for new types of understanding and assessments. And then hopefully the scientific community will respond to that need. And also by bringing together scientists in a concerted effort to solve these complex problems.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Miriam. We've just received a question around whether case studies on pollution and waste from all regions will be prioritized. Here, maybe I can take that question from Anna Odo. If you look at the work-related processes and procedures, it provides a detailed kind of stepwise process of how data sources will be used, etc. So I really encourage you to read those documents, and that will provide you the information that you're looking at. There's a question on how would plastic, microplastic, and nanoplastic pollution fit into the scope of chemical pollution, and what would be the best way to combat this type of pollution so that a multiplicity of efforts can be avoided. So I think this really refers back to the response that Michelle provided. It will depend on, of course, the types of questions that are being asked towards the panel and the topics that will be prioritized by the panel once it is established. There is a question on organization of Open-End Working Group 3 having the number of contact groups that will be on the topics that will be deliberated. For your information, that the chair will prepare a scenario note, which will be published in early June, which will provide the information about the organization of work for the third session, including the tentative schedule for that week. Again, there's a question around how the information will be made available to the public. And again, this is part of, in terms of the functions of the panel that have been agreed upon in terms of information sharing, communication, awareness raising. And these are discussions that will be taking place at the third session, and of course, and following the third session by the panel itself once it's established, in terms of operationalizing the different functions. And we very much hope that information will be shared in a very easy to understand, simple manner, and that easy for uptake for a number of different various bodies, including decision makers, including the public, etc. The question is also, the work program of the panel will be determined by the panel once established, noting that assessments are one of the foreseen functions. That's been responded to in the chat. I see that there are no more questions. Maybe I will give it another minute or two. And if not, I would really like to thank you all for participating today. We've had quite a number of participation, and so we hope that you found this webinar very useful. We look forward to seeing many of you in June in Geneva. Maybe just in terms of the closing, I'd like to highlight some of the key messages that we've heard today, that a multi-sectoral approach should be embedded in social dialogue, that the need for right to science needs to be safeguarded, the idea that we would have more solution-oriented analysis of this panel, and really we welcome you all to Geneva to have these further discussions and to ensure that we have a very good basis for starting our work for the new panel. Thank you very much, and I will now hand over to Diana. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nalini, and thank you to all the panelists who joined us today. So just bring to the attention of everybody, as I mentioned when we were launching this event, that the next session of this series, that is concluding this series, is taking place on the 6th of June. It's an hybrid event, so those who will be already in Geneva that week, you can join us at the International Environment House. 6th of June, 2 p.m. as usual, online and at the International Environment House. And we look, of course, forward to be and to join the SPP team and all the other colleagues at the CICG on the week of 17th of June. And and just bring also to the attention of those who are based in Geneva that we have a few other topics that we will be discussing in the next days and weeks. And next week we are celebrating the International Biodiversity Day. And at this special celebration that will take place in Geneva at Palais des Nations, we will also make links with the pollution cluster and how all these, the triple planetary crisis, all these three crises are interlinked. So with that, we thank you all for having joining this session. And we look forward to have you joining us also on the 6th of June. And of course, there are also other stakeholders also are organizing other webinars. You will find more information on our website and on the page of the series. We have been contacted by various other stakeholders that are also preparing sessions in preparation of the Open and Working Group 3 session in Geneva. So with that, thank you.
Thank you very
so
much.
much.
Thank you, panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you, colleagues. Bye.